Akash from the marketing team at Hackerearth, and you are watching This is Recruiting. This is episode 14 of our series, and over the last 6 months, we've spoken to a lot of recruiters who've helped you guys learn a lot of stuff about technical recruiting. Uh, Today, we've got a really special episode for you, and the topic we're going to be talking about is how to craft the ultimate technical interview process. Now, we are going to go ahead and revisit the foundations of technical recruiting. We're going to go to each phase and fill that up with a really sound process and system that you can use to make your technical recruiting process bulletproof. All right. Uh, to help us learn about this topic today, we've got two really good speakers. We've got Sachin Gupta, who is the CEO at Hackerearth, and we've got Amber Retke, who is a recruiter at Spring Venture Group. She comes from Kansas, and she's been a recruiter for a really long time. And while Amber has a lot of experience in recruiting for a bunch of different kinds of roles, from HR to marketing and operations, her specialty has always been technical recruiting. Uh, what Amber loves about the process and what she cares about deeply is about making sure that her candidates have a really nice, positive, and pleasant experience, because she understands that job searches can be really hard, can be really tough on candidates. So she really wants to make sure that people always have a nice, positive experience. And when Amber is not, recruiting, when she's not working, she spends a lot of time with her family, who are super huge on gaming. So Amber, welcome to the show. Sachin, welcome to the show. All
Thanks,
right,
Akash.
awesome. Uh,
You.
Great. So before we get started with the webinar, I'd like to take just a minute and talk to you guys about Hackerearth, right? Uh, you see that logo there. What does this company do? Well, Hackerearth has three really important offerings, and they're all targeted at you folks, recruiters and hiring managers. The first offering is the one we're really famous for. It is our developer assessment platform. With Hackerearth, you can basically build an assessment for any kind of developer role, any kind of developer programming language. You can build an assessment in about 2-3 minutes without any technical knowledge, send an invite out to thousands of candidates, and find the top 3-4 candidates in just like an hour or two, automated fully. It helps you find really skilled developer talent very quickly. So what used to take weeks, in terms of screening, now just takes an hour or two. Once you've found these dream candidates, once you've shortlisted on 3-4 candidates that you really like and you want to start talking to them, we've got a tool that we just released recently. It's called Face Code. It is the world's best developer interview tool. And why Face Code is awesome is because it has a beautiful, really powerful integrated developer environment. It's got video, and then it's got a whole bunch of other features that make it really special. For instance, we realize that a lot of hiring managers sometimes don't have the time to write their interview summary, and that task becomes pending for like a couple of days, maybe even weeks, and that slows down the process. With Hackerearth, if you just give the tool a couple of inputs, some micro inputs, Hackerearth writes the summary for you. So it saves hiring managers a lot of time. It makes sure that your entire panel of interviewers are all rating the candidate on a very standardized system. And then once you've got the right candidate, you can find them using Face Code. And then finally, we've got a third offering, which is a really cool offering. It is our virtual hackathons. And we believe that hackathons can be used at every stage of the developer lifecycle. You can use them to engage with the developer community. You can use it to outsource or crowdsource great ideas from developers everywhere to make your product even better. You can use it as a really strong hiring challenge, product. And you can have a really nice signature hiring challenge organized for you by the Hackerearth global team virtually. And you can offer these candidates a great experience, right? So Hackerearth managed services for virtual hackathons. So these are three offerings that we offer recruiters and hiring managers everywhere. It makes your entire recruiting process, like very, very accurate, fast, saves you a lot of money, and really lets you remove all the bias from your recruiting process. So now we're going to go ahead and move into the webinar, right? Uh, so I'm going to basically set the stage, right? I'm going to invite Amber to come along and set the stage for us and tell us what we're going to be discussing today. Amber, on to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Akash. Well, first of all, thank you so much to Hackerearth and the team for inviting me to be on the webinar today. Very honored and excited to chat with everybody about some of the technical interview pieces that we have set up today. So overall, really focusing in on the interview process. So as I'm sure you're all aware, technical recruiting is a very competitive market. And especially with everything happening last year in regards to the pandemic, I think one of the kind of silver linings is that companies are now much more open to the idea of permanently remote populations, which is something that the technology industry, I think, has always been more open to versus maybe some other industries. But it's creating a little bit of like I said, a competitive edge for organizations that are, maybe on the coast, able to offer a little bit higher compensation rate for someone in an organization like mine, where we are, Midwest based and used to kind of competing more with other Midwest states and companies. It's really just kind of expanding where people are able to go. So you can, maybe make a California salary while living and the cost of living in Kansas or Missouri or Nebraska. So the demand just continues to go up and up and up, and I think we will continue to see that. Also, the other thing that's super important about your interview process is, just like any other sort of review app or whatnot, we've got Glassdoor and we've got word of mouth. So when your candidates are going through your interview process, whether you end up making them an offer or not, whatever experience that they've had is now going to be a lot of people's first impression of your company through that individual. So whether it was positive or whether it was negative, that's going to be kind of out there now, whether they are going to the extent of posting something on a site like Glassdoor, or even just chatting with their friends and colleagues. And again, obviously for technology being so competitive, that first impression and what people, kind of perceive your company and your interview process to be like, very, very important. So, and that kind of goes in with the candidate engagement as well, because a lot of times candidates are interviewing with multiple companies. You want to make sure that you've developed an interview process that is easy for them to complete, that is as quick as possible in regards to getting them a final update of an offer or not, but also one that really gives them an idea about what your organization is about, what's important to it, giving them something to connect with, making sure that they've enjoyed, like I said, their experience from beginning to end. So those are kind of some of the things that we're going to cover today, as well as hopefully how you can make some of those things happen. So perfect. So some of those tough questions that we will also cover, and hopefully when we get to the end and we have the live questions, definitely would love to see what everyone is interested in hearing about. Talking about things like when to have the compensation conversation. I know a lot of recruiters kind of differ in regards to when they feel like that conversation needs to happen. So I'll kind of touch base on this a little bit further on in the presentation, but it's kind of my viewpoint to have that as soon as possible, because again, don't want to waste people's time if that's not aligned from a financial perspective. So I do that pretty much from the phone screen, making sure that we're at least on the same playing field. We don't have to go into specifics. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into someone's decision process in terms of, the benefits package, the work-life balance, the responsibilities, the opportunities for growth. So all of those things are factored in typically to someone's decision. But if somebody's asking, $230 and I can offer, $150, we're going to have issues down the road. So I'd rather just kind of suss that out from the beginning. Obviously, last minute reschedules. So I'm sure, as most of you are aware, getting interviews scheduled onto calendars for your tech team, regardless if it's an individual contributor, if it's a manager, if it's, in my case, our executive vice president of technology interviews almost every single candidate for our positions. It's difficult to get on there in the first place. And then when you have to make last minute changes, what are some things that you can kind of do to help alleviate that? So we'll chat about that as well. Again, competitive offer situations. I don't even know if I remember the last time I had a candidate that wasn't actively interviewing with other companies, if not like already had an offer on the table when they first applied to my rec. So chatting about that, how to make that process as expedited as possible for candidates. And then I know one of the questions, Akash, that I think already came in that we'll be addressing at the end is how to kind of go over technical questions and sourcing and phone screens. If you are a recruiter who doesn't have a technical background, including myself, including I think most technical recruiters. There are some that started off with a technical background and maybe had aspirations of doing, software engineering or development or administration or whatever the case may be. But I think for the most part, a lot of us come from either other areas of recruiting or human resources, or maybe you come from a communication background, whatever the case may be. A lot of really great technical recruiters probably wouldn't be able to code their way out of a paper bag. So chatting about kind of what those questions look like and really what you need to be kind of looking for as an interviewer, we'll kind of cover that as well. So. All right. And then the challenging section. So again, I think a lot of this kind of plays off of the previous slide. But again, really what we want to do as takeaways from today is working with schedules, coordinating between your interview team and your hiring manager team. The feedback point. So Hackerearth, as far as a feedback portal, is really great. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as far as a place where you can store kind of that initial information. And then also, obviously for a lot of recruiters, you're used to things like your applicant tracking system, your HRIS system. So kind of figuring out where the best place is to house all of that information, either from an ability to look back on it in the future, as far as maybe a candidate's applied multiple times, or for some of us, depending on what industry you're in and if your company does government contracts, sometimes you're a little bit more exposed to things like audits. So just kind of chatting about the best place to store that information and how to make it easily accessible and able to be queried easily. So kind of chatting about those as well.
Thanks, Amber. Thanks for setting the context, and excited to be doing this with you today. I just wanted to kind of chime in, on the points that you talked about. I think all of them really hit the nail on the head, and these are actual issues that a lot of recruiters out there are dealing with. And if they can go back today with some actionable insights on how they can do it better, I think it's a win-win on all sides. But particularly talking about full schedules and trying to coordinate between candidates who we all know are today, whenever they go out on a job hunt, they probably are looking at least 3-4 offers. So they're actively interviewing. And then on the other side, you've got your own engineering team, which is, while at the same time, battling with engineering deliverables, but also post-COVID. And that's my personal take, and would love to know what you think. The volume of meetings, at least virtual meetings, have just shot up. And I think it's become harder to actually get more time in the calendar, because now everything is structured. So calendars end up being full. So, dealing with the timelines on the candidate side, you want to make sure you close in the offer as quickly as possible. You want to get all the interviews on the on-sites or the virtual on-sites done while managing your hiring managers' calendars can actually be a very painful task. And combine that with, the offer negotiations. So the point that you brought about, talking about compensation upfront, I think it's very, very important. A lot of people, sometimes people shy away from doing it, because they're thinking, hey, do I want to set expectations when I don't even know what the candidate skill sets are and what the feedback is going to come in from the interviewing panel? But like you said, it's no point spending everyone's time if there's just not a match. So I think those are two key takeaways for me. And I think with that, we will segue into our first expert topic. Yeah. So, so according to you, what are the must-haves in an interview process while hiring tech talent?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. So first and foremost is the intake call for me. So what will happen is, typically our positions go through an approval process, through the manager, through human resources, through the finance team. And so once a position comes to me, then I find it very important to do an intake call with the hiring manager and whoever else it might be in the process. So for some of my positions that happen on a more regular basis, so maybe something that's more like a service desk specialist or an administrative type position, then sometimes for those, because they happen a little bit more often, it can be just a quick, 10-minute connect with the manager. I actually did one just this morning with a service desk position, and it's really just connecting and saying, hey, saw another role come through, our pipeline. Are there any changes from the last time we hired? Is there a different skill set that you're looking for? For me, like I said, even just having that quick 10-minute connect with the manager to make sure that nothing is different from what we've looked for previously. I feel like every new position is the opportunity to have value add to a team. So whether it's a different technical skill set, a different industry background, a different communication style, I really want to make sure that we're, looking for the right candidates and that I understand kind of what they're looking for when they go through those interviews. So that's the number one must-have for me is an intake call. I also think they're really important for new managers, and a lot of times that kind of back and forth that happens during that intake call is as much for a new manager as it is for me, because sometimes you have a manager who maybe this is their first person that they're hiring for your organization, or maybe it's the first person they've hired ever. So just giving them that opportunity to ask questions, understand that I am there to be a resource. I'm there to help them. I can get them, whatever documents, previous information that they're kind of looking for. I always try to come to those meetings with some information on things like how long did it take the last time that we tried to fill this position? Did we make any offers and they got declined, and for what reason? Did we seem to have any particular issues with certain areas that we could kind of identify as a trend? So was our compensation off? Were we looking for a skill set that wasn't really in the Kansas City area, so we had to go remote? So just kind of covering those right off the bat. So that's kind of the intake call before I've even posted a position. And then after that, once we get posted, I think having your sourcing strategy lined out is also very important. Again, technical talent is really competitive. And so right off the bat, I want to know what that tech stack looks like. And if I feel like it's a tech stack, or, the hiring manager and myself feel like it's a tech stack that's going to be difficult to find, already right off the bat, where else can we post it? I mean, obviously you've got the LinkedIn and the Dice and the Glassdoor and all of those places. And I can send out sourcing messages through LinkedIn or Indeed, but where other specific IT areas can we post to try to get as much exposure as early as possible? So whether that's with some of our local Kansas City organizations, we have quite a few that are general tech orgs, and then we also have the KC Tech Council, which is through our Department of Labor, and then there's also, for us at least, and I think for a lot of companies, where can we post it to try to drive a diverse traffic as well? So whether that's with the Society of Women Engineers, the National Society of Black Engineers, whether it's, again, more local in terms of like the Kansas City Women in Technology, making sure that we are making our post as visible as possible to the populations that we're trying to connect with and recruit to, is also a really important part of the process. And then you get into the interviews and you start with your tools. So Hackerearth for us has been, kind of game changing with everything last year. Spring Venture Group has been working remotely since March of last year, and we still don't have a date to go back into the office at this point in 2021. And so being able to find a tool like Hackerearth, especially with the face code aspect, where my managers feel like they still have that opportunity to do that live whiteboarding, and still be able to see a candidate and see their thought process as they're going through those coding motions, but doing it virtually has been great. So making sure that you have a tool that allows for whatever kind of analysis your team is wanting to see of a candidate, whether that's the coding portion or whether it's creating an assessment that they can review after the fact, or if there's other projects that you're creating, being able to make sure that we have exposure to those and we figure out what tools we can put in play, is also a huge piece. So those are probably the biggest things that I always like to make sure are in place and ready to go when we have a new technology position that comes open.
So thanks a lot for that. And I would like to double click a little bit on the intake call that you were talking about. So, as I say, planning is probably the most important aspect of executing anything. And I think that's what happens a lot in that intake call, setting expectations with the hiring manager, aligning yourself, making sure, if there are any tricky aspects of the role, then you kind of discover them upfront and plan for it. So do you tend to follow a certain structure, which is also used across the organization? And this is, more from perspective of recruiters are probably working in larger organizations. How should they look at an intake call? Should it be standardized across the org, or is this something that there are just some basic principles that you should cover, but it's basically a conversation between the recruiter and the hiring manager?
Yeah, great question. So I always think it's nice to standardize processes, regardless of kind of the size of an organization you work with, just because I think it makes it easy for the recruiter to not have to stop and think every time, like, okay, did I cover this? Did I cover this? Did I cover this? So I think that's always nice. And then, whether you're in a situation like myself where I am the only person who recruits for our corporate position. So, I mean, if somebody's got a corporate role, they know they're going to be chatting with me during that intake call. But if someone ends up leaving an organization, or if they do have more recruiters, and it just kind of depends on workload who might be working with that person, I think it's always kind of nice to have that standardized list of questions that you want to ask. I wouldn't go so far as to script it out. I mean, I feel like one of the most important things in building a relationship with your technology teams is authenticity. I think it's one of those things where people, I think, maybe have the tendency of being a little bit more guarded because they feel, because of that lack of technical background, that there might be, some issues there as far as how they're perceived, whether they're considered helpful. I know, again, some of the questions that came in kind of reflected that as well. And I have not had that issue, especially with my team. And I think part of the reason is because if you start off those conversations, laying the groundwork of, this is what I know, this is what I've done, this is what I'm comfortable with, what would you need from me? And just be open to the idea that, maybe there's some areas that you can improve on as a technical recruiter and things you can look into. But I think if you go in and it's very scripted and it's very closed off, I think it's hard to kind of have more of those open conversations. And then you're just doing an intake call instead of building a relationship. And I think you really need to do both of them at the same time. So what I would suggest is, just having those questions listed out that that you need to ask, as far as tech set and, time to fill, and when do you want this person to start, and what's your team size look like, going through that. And then for each recruiter, being able to have the flexibility to also add in additional questions, or remove questions if it's not pertinent to a particular position. I think having kind of a balance of those two things makes for the best conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point, that this call is not just for you to understand the process or set the expectations, but also to build that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, before we move on to the next topic, I have a question for the audience. All right, I want to launch up a quick poll here. And when you see this question, you understand how it is connected to the topic we're talking about today. Here we go. Right, so all of you should see a poll in front of you. Please take your time, read it, and choose an option. I see that about 40% of you have voted.
I'll be curious to see how many of them say all of the above.
Yeah, I think that is going to be the winner. We've
Catch
got 7.
everything. All of it takes a lot of time.
All right, we've got 70% votes. I'm going to wait for 20 more seconds, 10 more seconds, and we'll end the poll. So if you haven't voted, please do go ahead and pick an option. Okay, I think we're about done. I'm going to go ahead and close it. And these are our results.
Interesting. So, I feared we'll get, all of the above to be the leading response, but kind of, and it's kind of hard to unpack that. But let's look at the next two. So, 23% have talked about scheduling, and another 23% have talked about interview feedback, which is interesting. One is at the top of the funnel before you even set the interviews, and then it's towards the end where you have to just get all the feedback together. So, what's your take on that, Amber? Just few tips that have worked for you in the past. You being a single recruiter working across the org, I'm sure that must have been a challenge for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think some helpful things that work pretty well for our team is a lot of my technical folks are obviously in that manager level if they've got positions that are posted. And I find that a lot of them already block work time off on their calendar, which is dedicated towards typically just getting daily work done or professional development or whatever the case might be. So usually that's one of the questions I'll ask in the intake call, just so that I can get an idea of what their calendars look like. Again, I'm in a situation where we don't have a separate team that schedules interviews. So I do the candidate side, and then I'm the one who schedules the interviews as well. So chatting with managers in that intake call about their availability, and I'll usually preemptively look at their calendars and say, hey, it looks like you do a block time between 1 and 5 on Tuesday, Thursday. Is that free time? Is that time that you are honestly unavailable? So really just kind of having those conversations right off the bat, so you kind of know beforehand where people can slip in and what you might be able to schedule over. I also tell people on the opposite end, if you have certain times that you definitely don't want to interview just because of the way your schedule works, also mark those for me so that I don't have to remember on a case-by-case basis. If you take your kids to school and you can't start interviewing someone until 9, block off your calendar from 8 to 9, because with so many positions and so many teams, it's pretty hard to keep track of kind of like individual requests as far as that goes. So I usually make that request to teams as well during those intake calls, is, just so I make sure that I don't accidentally book something that you are not going to be comfortable with. If you need to have a lunch and it's noon to 1, then block that off. Or if you have to go pick somebody up from 3 to 3:30, block that off. So again, my teams are really open and understanding of the volume that we deal with, and really accommodating in terms of updating their calendars in terms of that, which again, I know I am lucky for because they're so used to dealing with me. So when you work in higher volume, I know that calendars can be even more conflicting and hard to deal with. So I guess that's on the calendar side. And then the other piece I think also makes absolute sense is that feedback. Do people keep that individually? Do they keep it in a side system like Hackerearth? Do they keep it in their applicant tracking system? Are they even keeping it at all? So really kind of trying to figure out how to collaborate all of that together. I think the nice thing with that is once you get a system in place, then I think it becomes a little bit more automated. So it's really just kind of figuring out for your organization, where do we store this information, and how do we go about collecting it? And I think once you have that process in place, it's a lot easier to communicate to hiring managers what those expectations are. So I want all of our candidates evaluated within a 48-hour period. And, we need feedback within 24 hours after you've interviewed. And that way, again, you're just setting expectations. People understand what is and isn't acceptable as far as the feedback they provide. So I think it's really just giving that information to your interviewer team, so that they understand, they feel prepared, they feel like they have the resources that they need, and they understand what your role is and what your expectations are, and then what's expected of them.
Got it. And obviously setting that process and the timeline upfront, puts that expectation in, and people know what they're kind of working towards. But there's still this human nature of procrastinating. You just ended an interview, you've got a deadline that you got to move over to. How do you set that hygiene in that the feedback should come in immediately, and it's not only important from a timeline perspective, but also from the aspect of giving a fair evaluation, right? The longer we wait after the interview, the more
Mhm.
selective our memory is of what happened in the
Mhm.
interview, and we tend to remember the highlights. So just to be, to make sure that a fair evaluation is coming in, like, is there a mandate that has been set top down, or is it just, you spend that much time educating the interviewing panel? So how does it work out in your organization, and how you've been successful in doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Hackerearth is great because when you go to log out of the interview, especially again for face code, which is primarily what we use it for, it requires you to enter kind of that information before you log out of the full interview. So you do the interview, the candidate leaves, and then whatever kind of outline that you have created beforehand. So, which again is usually something we do during the intake call. That evaluation happens before our interviewers log off of the call. And usually I try to pad interviews a little bit, even if it's just by 10 or 15 minutes. Someone tells me like, oh, it'll probably take like, half an hour to 45 minutes. I'll probably book that for an hour. Just so that immediately afterwards, the time is already embedded. Take that 15 minutes. It doesn't take very long to go ahead and put that information in. I think for recruiters to kind of preemptively work through what the schedule looks like, if you can figure out how to get that extra like 5-10 minutes in at the end of whatever those interviews are that you're scheduling, then it's just more likely that you'll be able to get the update that you need as quickly as you need it. So, and then, yeah, to your point, I mean, there's always human error, or emergencies that come up or whatever the case may be. And again, I think that's just emphasizing how important having those relationships are. There's some of my hiring managers where I'll text them and I'll be like, hey, sorry your son was sick today. If you have time later tonight, can you go ahead and enter that feedback? Or pinging them, or, you can kind of request that sort of information in a way that is kind of less aggressive and less demanding and more fun, I guess. Which they usually respond to a little bit more versus like, you did not turn in your feedback, like I need it within the next 12 hours or whatever the case is. So if you have that relationship already developed, then it's a little bit more, I have hiring managers that are like, oh yeah, Amber's got to bother me again because I didn't. And I'm like, yep, pinging you again. It's happening again. It will continue to happen until I get my feedback. So.
Makes so much sense. A recurring theme that comes across our conversation is, while you can set good processes, you can use the right tools. It's very, very critical to have that relationship in the team, because at some point, those processes and tools will not do what they're expected to do, and then that's when the relationships really come into picture. So one of the questions that came in from Susan from the audience is like, how are you currently using Hackerearth? So if you could, kind of just segue briefly and talk about where does the tool sit in your process?
In the process? Yeah, absolutely. So we are in a little bit of a unique situation. So previously being a couple of years ago, we were hiring for a lot more early entry opportunities, at which point we used Hackerearth for more of the assessment side. So as Akash kind of mentioned, sort of what Hackerearth was originally kind of formulated around was the opportunity to create pre-written assessments off of interview questions that were available through Hackerearth that would get sent to candidates in that first step of an interview. So an application comes in, it gets reviewed, it looks like someone meets basics, and then we would send out that evaluation that candidates would complete. And then once they submitted that, hiring managers would review that, and then we would go into interviews. So I think that process works a little bit better for, again, kind of higher volume, earlier entry individuals, primarily because they're typically more willing to do it. For what we've been recruiting for now for the past probably year and a half or so has been a lot higher level of candidate, to be honest. So, software engineer 3s, solution architects, Salesforce developers, people who have a decent amount of, work experience under their belt. So what we've really been using Hackerearth for on a much higher level the past like I said, year or so, has been the face coding aspect. And again, a big portion of that is because we're not in the office, we're not able to do on-site interviews. And, when I'm doing a solution architect hire or a software engineer 3 hire, not being able to do kind of that live coding was really inhibiting to my team in regards to feeling like they could make a good decision on someone. You can always ask for previous work examples, but then there's a lot of pieces that are not able to be shared. And plus people have the option to kind of edit things and make it as nice as possible before they share it with you. So what we do now is, candidates apply, we still go through that review process. But then the interviews that would typically have been the first technical on-site interviews, we now go through Hackerearth. And again, it's nice because it kind of saves us a step. You don't have to worry about doing the technical piece and then after the fact doing the non-technical piece because of the video capabilities on Hackerearth. So a lot of my teams essentially ask both types of questions. And when they're doing the non-technical questions or the non-coding questions, then they'll expand the video screen so that it's just like if you were doing, a Google Meet or a Zoom or a Teams, whatever the case may be. But then when you're going into the coding of it, then your video shrinks down into the corner. You can still see everyone involved in the interviews, but the majority of the screen is then taken up by the coding tool. So they're able to use that. And we typically do, the 60 or 90-minute interviews, however long they end up being. And that's kind of what's replaced our on-site interviews.
Thanks for that. So I think with that, we'll move to the next the next expert discussion. Or I think we've already covered that, Akash.
Yes. Before we go there, we have one small poll that we'd like to share. It has a big connection with the next question that we've got coming up. It's a short poll. I'm going to go ahead and launch it. This is a really simple question compared to the last one.
It might be simple, but I don't know if people would like the answer when they have to stop and think about it. How much time do I spend scheduling calendars?
Okay, so I think we've got our responses. Let me go ahead and share the results. And here we are. So a whopping 51% spend about 10% of their time on scheduling interviews.
So what's your take on that, Amber? While we still have, about 49%, which is in the 25 to 50% is significantly high just from, the time spent in trying to coordinate. But even then, the question, like, why does almost, I think 50% of the audience saying that they're spending a significant amount of time is definitely a matter of concern. So I think maybe, with that, to kind of talk about that, we could move on to the next question. Akash, if you could.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, what's your strategy to shorten time to interview? And this kind of rolls up the whole aspect of reducing the time spent in trying to get together the candidates and the hiring managers.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we have recently kind of chatted about within our technology department is how many interviews do you really need in order to go from an applicant to an offer? I think for a lot of individuals, especially when we did the transition to working from home and having to do all virtual interviews, I don't know if other people saw this, but I know for our teams, it kind of almost increased then the amount of interviews that people were wanting to see. I think for two reasons. So number one, because people don't have to come into the office at this point to interview, I think people being, my teams were kind of along the thought process of, well, we wouldn't have to have them come back into the office to do another final round interview or to meet with this executive or, whatever the case would be. So in their heads, it was kind of, I think it's kind of like the situation with like diet pop, where people are like, you get in trouble with diet soda because you think it's diet soda, so you drink more of it. I feel like that's what happened with my interviews, where it was like, well, you don't have to come into the office for them. So like, it should be fine that we schedule like 5 extra, which, recruiters know is not the case. So I think kind of resetting expectations with teams in regards to, okay, from point A to point B, do we really need to have 4 different interviews that are happening in order to make an offer for a solution architect or for a software engineer? And typically the answer is, no. We can limit it back down to maybe an initial phone screen, which is typically with me, to kind of suss out initial technical talent, communication style, culture fit, salary, all of those things. And then going into what is kind of the bulk of our interviews typically, which is usually where Hackerearth comes in, but figuring out whether it's a 60-minute or a 90-minute interview, and then adding those individuals on, which a lot of times ends up being multiple people for us. So it's nice to kind of have a panel of maybe 2 or 3 folks that are in one interview versus those 2 or 3 people individually interviewing and making the process longer. And then, like I said, our final interviews usually include like a 30-minute connect with either our VP of engineering or our EVP of technology, or both. And that final conversation is, we definitely use it to evaluate that talent, but it's almost more for the candidate to kind of show them that for us, building out our teams is important. And our executive teams want to be a part of those conversations. And regardless if you're a base data engineer or if you're going to be our solution architect, giving them exposure to the executive team, I think, is really important, and just a good showing for the candidate themselves. So that's kind of typically our process now is phone screen, main technical interview, and then that final interview with our executive team.
Got it. So if I got it correctly, talking about how do we really need those many interviews, and be trying to, if multiple people want to be part of the process, look at whether you can convert that one-on-one to a panel, and that can actually help you reduce the number of interviews. So that's definitely helpful. So I think with that, we move on to our next question. Oh, so we have another audience. Do we have another audience? No. So what are some simple systems to overcome day-to-day challenges when it comes to interview coordination between candidates and hiring managers?
Yeah. So I think if you have high enough volume, having a candidate self-scheduling tool is definitely helpful. We don't have a high enough volume on the technical side that we do that, but I will say for our company as a whole, there are areas that we do a lot higher volume, specifically with like our inside sales agent position. And so we use a self-scheduling tool. So that's nice because our interview team essentially outlines when they're comfortable interviewing. We submit that through our system, and then candidates schedule themselves. So if you're in a situation where you've got quite a bit of high volume happening, then I think those candidate self-scheduling tools are great. Again, for myself, I do the personal scheduling, and again, preemptively knowing where I can block time or asking the team to block time for me so that I don't have to worry about when I'm on the phone with the candidate trying to figure out where it all fits together. I kind of can tell a candidate right off the bat, like, hey, I don't know what your schedule looks like, but I know my team's open, Monday, Wednesday afternoons. Would that work for you? And if not, then we're flexible, but typically candidates will just say, yeah, I think I can make 2 to 3 work, or whatever the case is. So I would say those are kind of some helpful things to kind of expedite the process of getting people scheduled on very full calendars.
Got it. That makes sense. So I think Amber, we're coming towards the last part of the webinar today. I think I would like to leave the audience with 2 key takeaways while we've already discussed tons of insightful things. And you did touch upon this in the beginning. how do, as a non-tech recruiter, so the first question is in the context of being a non-technical person but doing technical recruiting. It's important for you to create high quality top of the funnel, but you're not from that trade. So how do you kind of assess those skills upfront, as your own phone screen, if you're doing a phone screen as a recruiter, and then also in the process itself, have you done something in the past with your interviewer hiring managers that have helped you assess the candidate skills better? But let's start with the first one, like as a recruiter, what are some of the effective interview questions that you tend to use over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think part of it just comes with the being comfortable after you've been in the industry for a little bit, which if anybody's on here that's like, oh, I've only been doing this for 6 months, so that doesn't really help me, Amber. But I mean, you do just become more aware, more cognizant of, different tools, different tech stacks, different, trends that are happening in the industry, and they just kind of stick with you, I guess, a little bit more. For those who are really new at it, again, I just preaching to the choir, but that intake call, it can be so helpful when you are trying to work with a hiring manager and saying, okay, so if you're saying that somebody needs to be entry-level Java or proficient in SQL or whatever the case may be, really figuring out what questions from a technical aspect you are going to be asking candidates, and then what answers you should be getting back. Because if you're not from a technical background, it's pretty easy for someone to kind of fluff their way through and you just don't know whether or not that's what's happening. So kind of understanding from your hiring manager, like what are some of the keywords that someone should be saying if I ask about AWS experience or whatever the case may be. The assessments are also really helpful because that having an assessment kind of takes that piece out of it for the recruiter. You can sit down with your hiring manager, you can go over what questions you want in the assessment, and then you're not typically the one who's even evaluating, the technical skill level. So that's, if that's an option that someone has, then fantastic. Again, we use that more for our early entry type positions. And then for our, more niche skill set or our higher experience level, again, that's typically at such a high level that when I'm, talking with candidates, whether I'm sourcing them or I'm phone screening them or whatever the case may be, we don't even really get too in depth from a technical standpoint outside of what I know my team has to offer as far as, being cutting edge in technology and the different tech stacks that we utilize. It's not really so much about evaluating the candidate's technical ability. For me at that point, it's more about selling our technology to the candidate. And then the technical piece happens on the end. Because again, at that point, you're talking with people who are 10, 15, 20 years in the industry. Right. So that's kind of the pieces that we use for effective questioning.
Makes sense. And then the second question is, what are some of the effective tools besides obviously an applicant tracking system that make tech hiring simple and efficient for you?
Yeah, I would say probably the top two that come to mind would be Hackerearth because of that face code option. And then also whatever your HRIS system is, making sure that it can be integrated with your applicant tracking system, I think is huge. We've, more recently done that at our organization, and not having to worry about what that transition looks like for hires as far as the information they've provided. And we ask a lot of things on the application that we want to make sure that we keep if someone ends up being a hire. So we ask things like, what's your preferred pronoun? What's your preferred name? We want to make sure that we make people feel as comfortable as possible. And one of the ways you can do that is not asking them those questions a million times. So we get it from the application standpoint. And then if you have an integrated system, then it's a lot easier to keep track of all that data where someone's not manually entering it. Number one, because of time constraints, and number two, because of errors. And so I would say those are the two biggest things for us is Hackerearth, and then the integration that happens between our ATS and our HRIS system.
Thanks a lot for that. Great to know. So I think, with that, we come to the last bit before we move on to the audience questions. I believe, you're an avid reader, you enjoy reading, and there have been some books that have helped you become better at what you do. So any recommendations and advice for the audience today on what books to read?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, are they going to, I think we have a slide about them, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to pull up. Awesome. So these are some books that I've read, well, actually I'm still reading A Promised Land. It's a doozy of a book. But so the first one, The Robot Proof Recruiter, I read almost kind of at the beginning of quarantine, I guess, is kind of around there. But Katrina wrote that book. I think it was published in 2019. It is very interesting in regards to the idea of AI taking the place of live recruiters. And it's really kind of setting up recruiters on how to, I don't want to say sell themselves, but really kind of emphasize the, kind of the additions and the things that a technical recruiter brings into the process versus not just technical, but a recruiter in general versus having a completely automated system. So I think it's really great and very applicable to what's been happening over the previous year and a half, where it's this combination of the more automated you get, the quicker the process, the more efficient. There's a lot of benefits to that. But then on the flip side, if it becomes too automated, where does that human connection kind of come back in? And that's really what she kind of emphasizes in her book, as far as the piece that a recruiter brings in, as far as, speaking with candidates about the position, selling the culture, things like that. So that's a really great book, very interesting. And I think will just become more and more pertinent as we see what effects 2020 kind of do for recruiting in general, just as an industry. Military Past, Civilian Present. I read this one this year, I guess like end of last year, because one of the main initiatives for our organization is diversifying our population. And I think diversity can be so overwhelming sometimes because there's so many different areas. And I think for a successful diversity strategy to take place, I think you really need to kind of hone in on certain areas that you want to see increase. So one of the areas that we wanted to focus on that we have, statistics around and goals set around is our veteran population. So that's why I started reading this book, is just in regards to that transition that people go through when they go from military to civilian life, and what sort of things they're looking for that make them feel like they have support and that they're successful and they've got resources. So if you are looking at trying to target your veteran population, or even creating, again, resources around having things to help support your current veteran population, that's a really great one. And then the reason that I mentioned A Promised Land, I'm not trying to push a political agenda at all, I promise. I just threw it out there because it's a book that I'm reading personally right now. And I think it's so easy for recruiters, and a lot of people, not just recruiters, but for me anyway, it's really easy to get absorbed and to forget about that work-life balance, because you're typically talking about candidates on different coasts or in different countries, and you've got different time zones you're trying to work with. And so it's not an 8-to-5 job. And I think we're all kind of aware of that. And so I always one of the things that I recommend to really anybody, but I mean, especially folks that ask for, mentoring or suggestions or whatnot in human resources, is just to make sure that you keep your own personal interests alive, and that you are reading books that are for you and not for your industry, or that you're participating in activities, or, whether it's, making sure that you're healthy and you're working out, which probably should be me, but it's not. Or whether you're, kind of looking at other interests or family time. Like Akash mentioned, we're a very gaming heavy family, but making sure that you keep those pieces in and you schedule time for those within your calendar is really what you need in order to kind of help refresh yourself. Because if not, and you see it a lot in the industry, there's a huge burnout for recruiters, specifically for technical recruiters. It's very high demand, it's very competitive, and it can be really overwhelming. So that just happens to be one of the books that I'm reading for fun, that I would encourage everybody to do. It doesn't have to be a promised land. It is a good book, but whatever interests you have, make sure that you keep time for those in your calendar as well. You block your calendar for those.
I think that's very, very relevant advice. It's very, it's not that hard to kind of get burnt out. And when that happens, it's a bigger loss, because then you won't be able to put in the amount of energy, focus that you were putting in at work earlier. So it really makes no sense to, kind of go all out and end up being super efficient for a short duration of time. And then, all of that is lost. So, and I'm definitely going back with this recommendation. So I've been wanting to read this book for some time. And now when I see it on the screen here, I think I've got another push, and I'm going to, go ahead and read this one. So I think with that, we are at the end of the session. We now have some questions from the audience. Akash, do you want to take that over?
Yep, we've got two questions that I can see right here. The first one is a question for Amber. When it comes to screening technical folks, how does a recruiter who is not a coder identify the correct profile? What are those cues that you look for? Is what Martin here is asking us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it depends on obviously the type of position that you're either sourcing for or screening for. Again, I just recommend connecting with the managers to figure out what those keywords should be. If I mention Python, somebody should be talking to me about pandas and PySparks and engineering libraries, or a similar language like R. I mean, those are kind of the keys that your hiring managers can kind of give you in order to make sure that you're at least passing along candidates that, may not end up being the ideal technical talent that they're looking for, but that they're viable candidates. All
right. We've got one more question. So another member of the audience is asking us, what is the reason behind a few technical management folks, basically not respecting hiring folks? It's a very controversial question, but yeah, this is the second question that came in.
Oh shoot! Sounds like somebody not having a good experience. I mean, I guess I should say that I absolutely am a fanatic of my technical team. So I think it's just assumptions maybe that get made as far as how useful a technical recruiter can be. Again, not coming from that technical background, I think it's easy. And I can even, empathetically see how somebody who's a software engineer and has been doing it for 10 years is like, well, how are you going to find me technical talent when you don't even know how to code? And so I think it's just kind of being open and trying not to take offense to that. And coming in with the idea that I am here to help you. You have to have that confidence in yourself. I mean, you're in that job for a reason. So whether it's your organizational skills, if it's your communication skills, if it's your ability to sell the job, you have to be confident in what you're bringing to the table, even if it's not necessarily technical knowledge, and share that with them so that they understand what their skill set is and what your skill set is. And so I would say, having those intake calls where you try to gain that mutual respect. And again, I think empathy is such a huge thing, where there are times where I might get frustrated with my teams, and then I have to stop and think like, oh gosh, they just had to do a huge rollout for XYZ. They've probably been working 60, 70 hours for the past 2 weeks. Whatever the case is, we all get kind of caught up in our own world and what we need to see done. And I think taking a step back and being like, okay, I get where your frustrations come from because you have deliverables, and obviously you're short people on your team, or else you wouldn't be hiring somebody, right? So kind of keeping that in mind and trying to frame the conversation around that, I think is kind of a lot easier than focusing on the aggression part of it.
Got it. We got one other question that just came in from Mr. Ajay Mehta, and he's asking, how do you identify the technology listed in the how do you figure out if the technology listed in the resume is actually the technology that the candidate is good at using? Do you have any questions or ways of figuring that out in the interview?
Yeah, I mean, that feels like to me more of what our Hackerearth piece does. And so for our team, when they go through and do those technical interviews, I mean, that's why the face code is so important to us, so that we can see that coding to make sure that it's not just something on a resume, that it's not, I mean, even if somebody has actually been doing the work, sometimes it's not to the level that, you know, your team is wanting to see. So whether it's, you know, fabricated from the resume, or whether it's just not at the level of talent that we need to be at for our position, being able to see, you know, kind of that individual do that live coding, ask them questions about their coding, tell them to walk you through what the process looks like, that's really, you know, kind of key for us, and what we didn't want to lose when we no longer were doing on-site interviews.
Okay. Um, we've got a question from Anu over here, and she's asking us if there's a situation where you can't find the required combination of technical skills from the candidates in your pool, and your manager is not ready to negotiate on that skill set, what do you do?
Source, source, and source, and
Source
source.
harder.
Source, yeah. And I guess, you know, again, having those conversations about why it's so difficult to find someone of that particular technical talent, if it's just not a very commonly used technology, or if it's just an unusual combination of technical skills and backgrounds. And then also, you know, requesting and kind of putting the onus back on your technology team, to the fact that, again, you are not in the technical world and they are. So what are some of the steps that you can take in order to get access to their networks? Because that's where you're going to find those individuals with that type of talent. So are your technical managers posting about their job? Are they participating in, you know, activities and organizations that are getting your company name out there? Everybody kind of has the silent title of recruiter when you work for an organization. So just making sure that you're connecting with the managers to say, hey, I'm really struggling to find this. Like, do you have people from your background that have this? Can you give me samples of candidates that are what you want to see? And then that way you can use those as resources moving forward.
Got it. We'll just take one last question. This one's for Sachin. Mervin is asking us if Hackerearth can be used to evaluate technical skills of enterprise products like Salesforce and SAP.
Yeah. So yes, the we support a very vast variety of skill sets, which includes some of the enterprise products like Salesforce, SAP. Within SAP, we have tons of other modules that we cover. So we do that with a combination of multiple choice questions specific to these technologies, and say combine that with a couple of coding questions to test whether the developer has actual hands-on programming skills. So you can set up tests for these skills as well.
Okay, great. Awesome. So I guess that wraps up our live question round Q&A. Awesome. So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the webinar. Amber, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your time and your thoughts and your experience. Sachin, thank you so much for leading this conversation. Before you leave, ladies and gentlemen, I have two small requests for you. First, I would like you guys to go ahead and check out the resources section on the Hackerearth website. We've got an entire archive of webinars. We've been doing this for a while. We've been talking to some of the world's best recruiters for a while now. So if there's any topic that you can think about with relation to technical recruitment, there's a very good chance that we've got some solid content on that topic in our archive. So please go ahead, check it out. We've got a lot of great content and they're all free to watch on demand. The second thing I want to talk to you guys about is this very cool thing that's coming out very soon. We are releasing a very special format of webinar very soon. It's called Build Your Own Webinar. It's a lot like walking into a sandwich bar and building your own sandwich, right? You get to choose your own kind of bread, the toppings. You like to make it the way you like it. In a similar way, we're going to be spending a lot of time over the next few weeks collecting, requests from you on topics, hearing your questions out, and finally sort of letting you vote on topics, so that when you come for one of these special webinars, the content that we're serving up is exactly what you want to consume and learn to get better at your day to day. So watch out for an email on that over the next week. It's called Build Your Own Webinar from Hackerearth, and we're going to basically make sure that these one of these episodes every month is going to be tailored to suit exactly what you need to get better at work. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for making it here today. That brings us to the end. We will see you guys in the next one. Keep looking out for our emails for new webinar episodes. Thank you.